hitting recording. Okay, this is shortly after the possibly very traumatic story of the fish. So we're hopefully moving on to something that just makes me want to kill Lantern instead. Instead of
Oh,
the.
you. If you don't want to kill me at the end of this joke, I am doing it wrong. Meg actually knows this joke. I know she referenced it at the end of the last stream. Um, all right. I guess I'd better get into it because we have crap to do.
Yep.
So there's a man crawling through the desert. He decided to try his SUV in a little bit of cross-country travel, had great fun zooming over the Badlands and through the sand, got lost, hit a big rock, and couldn't get it started again. There are not any cell phone towers anywhere nearby, so his phone, useless. No family, his parents had died out a few years before, and his few friends had no idea he was out there. So always remember when you're going out on an adventure, just let people know you're doing it. Just little PSA. He stayed with the car a day or so, but his one bottle of water ran out, and he was getting very thirsty. He thought maybe he knew the direction back now that he'd paid attention to the sun, and he thought he'd figured out which way was north, so he decided to start walking. Figured he only had to go about 30 miles or so, and he'd be back to the small town he'd gotten gas in last. He thinks about walking at night to avoid the heat and the sun, much like the Desert of Death in Breath of Fire 3.
Ah!
But based upon how dark it actually was the night before, and given that he has no flashlight, he was afraid that he'll break a leg or step on a rattlesnake or get eaten by a grue. So he puts on some sunblock, puts the rest in his pocket for reapplication later, brings a fashionable umbrella he'd had in the back of the SUV with him to give him a little shade, pours the windshield wiper fluid into his water bottle in case he gets that desperate, brings his pocket knife because you never know when you might need it. After all, you might find a cactus with cactus juice, which is the quenchiest,
Yes,
and heads out in the direction that he thinks is right.
but he didn't bring a
He
towel?
He's not a fruit who knows where his towel is. Clearly. Otherwise, he'd never have gotten into this mess in the first place.
Yes.
He walks for the entire day. By the end of the day, he's really thirsty. He's been sweating all day and his lips are starting to crack. He's reapplied sunblock twice and tried to stay under the umbrella, but he still feels sunburned. The windshield wiper and the fluid is starting to sound really good right about now. He knows that it's mainly water and some ethanol and coloring, but he also knows there's some kind of poison in it to keep people from drinking it. He wonders what the poison is and whether it'll be worse than dying of thirst. He pushes on, trying to get to the small town before dark. By the end of the day, he starts getting worried. He figures he's been walking at least 3 miles an hour, according to his watch, over 10 hours. That means if his estimate was right, he should be close to town. Fortunately, he doesn't recognize any of this. My God, he is in the Desert of Death.
Ah!
He had to he had to cross a dry creek bed a mile or two back, and he doesn't remember coming through it in the SUV. He figures that maybe he got his direction just a little bit off, and the dry creek bed was just off to one side of his path. He tells himself that he's close, and that after dark he'll start seeing the town light over one of these hills. That'll be all he needs. As it gets dim enough that he starts stumbling over small rocks and things, he finds a spot and sits down and waits for full dark and the town lights. Full dark comes around before he knows it. He must have dozed off. He stands back up and turns all the way around. It dark. It very dark. Stars. Lot of stars. No
Hi.
town. Hello. He wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely lousy. Dehydration sucks. It really does. His eyes are gummy, his mouth and nose feel like they're full of sand. I hate sand. It's coarse and rough and it gets everywhere.
Like
He's
glitter.
so thirsty he can't. Yes, like glitter. He's so thirsty he can't even swallow. He barely got any sleep because it was so cold. He'd forgotten how cold it got at night in the desert and hadn't noticed it the night before because he'd been in his car. He knows the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Then you dead. Some people can make it a little longer in the best situations. This, not the best situation.
Mm-mm.
Unless he finds water, he figures this is the dawn of the final day. He rinses out his mouth a little bit with the windshield wiper fluid. He waits for a while after spitting that out a bit to see if his mouth goes numb, or if he feels dizzy, or has his mouth gone numb? It's all in his head? He's not sure. He'll go just a little bit further, and if he still doesn't find water, he'll try drinking some of the fluid. Then he has to face his next, harder question. Which way does he go from here? Does he keep walking the same way as yesterday, assuming that he still knows which way that is? Or does he try a new direction? He has no idea what to do. Looking at the hills and the dunes around him, he thinks he knows the direction he was heading before. Just going by feeling, he points himself somewhere to the left of that and starts a-walking. As he walks, the day starts heating up. The desert, too cold just a couple hours before, soon becomes an oven again. He sweats a little at first, and then stops. That's a bad sign.
Mhm.
When you stop sweating, you in trouble. It's usually right before heat stroke, which sucks horribly. Been there. He decides that it's time to try the windshield wiper fluid. He can't wait any longer. If he passes out, he's dead. He stops in the shade of a large rock, takes the bottle out, opens it, and takes a mouthful. He slowly swallows it, making it last as long as he can. Ah! Life-giving windshield wiper fluid. Nectar of
Two
the
of the
gods.
gods.
He takes another mouthful and makes it last too. Slowly, he drinks half the bottle. He figures that since he's drinking it, he may as well drink enough to make some difference and keep himself from passing out. I mean, if you're gonna be a bear, be a grizzly. He's quit worrying about the denaturing of the wiper fluid. If it kills him, it kills him. If he didn't drink it, die anyway. Besides, he's pretty sure that whatever substance they denature the fluid with, it's just designed to make you sick. Their way of keeping winos from buying cheap wiper fluid for the ethanol content. He can handle throwing up if it comes to that. He walks. He walks in the hot, dry, windless desert. Sand, rocks, hills, dunes, the occasional scrawny cactus or dried bush. No
And a
sign of
giant
water.
swarm.
I was considering making that reference. We have worm sign, the likes of which God himself has never seen. But no sign of water. Sometimes he'll see a little movement to one side or the other, but whatever moved is usually gone before he can focus his eye on it. Probably birds, lizards, mice, maybe shai-hulud, though they usually move more at night. He's careful to stay away from the movements. After a while, he begins to stagger. He's not sure if it's fatigue, heat stroke finally catching up to him, or maybe he was wrong and the denaturing of the wiper fluid was worse than he thought. He tries to steady himself and keep going. After more walking, he comes to a large stretch of sand. This is good, is it? He knows he passed over a stretch of sand in the SUV. He remembers doing donuts in it.
Donuts.
Or at least he thinks he remembers it. He's getting woozy enough and tired enough that he's not sure what he remembers anymore or if he's hallucinating. Is that the Sega Saturn? He thinks he remembers it, so he heads off into it, trying to get to the other side, hoping that it gets him closer to town. He was heading for town, wasn't he? He thinks he was. He isn't sure anymore. He's not even sure how long he's been walking anymore. Is it still morning? Has it moved into afternoon, and is the sun going down again? It must be afternoon. It seems like it's been too long since he started out. Maybe it's tomorrow. Maybe we're Daniel. He walks through the sand. After a while, he comes to a big dune in the sand. This is bad. He doesn't remember any dunes from when he was driving over the sand in his SUV. At least he doesn't think he remembers any. This is bad. All the same, he has no other direction to go. Too late to turn back now. He figures that he'll get to the top of the dune and see if he can see anything from there that can help him find the town. He keeps going up the dune. Halfway up, he slips in the bad footing of the sand for the second or third time and falls to his knees. He doesn't feel like getting back up since he'll just fall down again. He keeps going up the dune on his hands and knees. While crawling, If his throat weren't so dry, he'd laugh. He's finally gotten to the hackneyed image of a man lost in the desert, crawling through the sand on his hands and knees. If only there was a cow skull over there, it would be the perfect image. His clothes just need to be a little more ragged. People crawling through the desert always had ragged clothes, but his have lasted without any rips so far. Somebody will probably find his desiccated corpse halfway buried in the sand years from now, and his clothes will still be in fine shape. Shake the sand out, give them a good wash, and they'd be wearable again, and also you'd have people jerky. He wishes his throat were wet enough to laugh. He coughs a little instead, and it hurts. He finally makes it to the top of the sand dune. Now that he's at the top, he struggles a little, but manages to stand up and look around. Yo, listen up, here's a story about a little guy that lives in a sand world. And all day and all night, and everything he sees is sand for himself and everybody around. And behind him, about a mile away, he thinks he sees the rocky ground he left to head into the sand. Ahead of him, more dunes, more sands. This isn't where he drove his SUV. This is hell. Or Pittsburgh. Or close enough. Again, he doesn't know what to do. He decides to drink the rest of the wiper fluid while figuring it out. He takes out the bottle and starts removing the cap while he glances to the side and sees something. Something in the sand. At the bottom of the dune, off to the side, he sees something strange. It's a flat area in the sand. He stops opening the bottle and tries to look closer. The area seems to be circular, and it's dark, darker than the sand. And there seems to be something in the middle of it, but he can't tell what it is. So he looks as hard as he can, but still can't tell from here. He's gonna have to go down there and take a look. It's in a book, Reading Rainbow. He puts the bottle back into his pocket and starts to stumble down the dune. After a few steps, he realizes that he's in trouble. He's not going to be able to keep his balance. After a couple more sliding, tottering steps, he falls. Rollin', 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 keep those doggies rollin'. They're so hot and swollen, rawhide.
Then tumbleweed comes by. That's my line. And rolls off.
I actually saw a tumbleweed pass by work the other day. But anyway, the sand, it's so hot, and he thinks he's caught on fire on the way down. Like a movie car wreck flashing into flames as it goes over the cliff. Apparently, this guy is made out of Ford Pinto. He closes his eyes and mouth, covers his face with his hands, and waits to stop rolling. He stops at the bottom of the dune. After a minute or two, he finds enough energy to try and sit up and get the sand out of his clothes and face. When he clears his eyes enough, he looks around to make sure the dark spot in the sand is still there and he hadn't just imagined it. Seeing the large, flat, dark spot on the sand still there, he crawls toward it. He'd get up and walk towards it, but he doesn't seem to have the energy to get up and walk right now. He must be in the final stages of dehydration, he figures, as he crawls. If the place in the sand doesn't have water, he'll likely never make it anywhere else. This is his last chance. This is himself. Under pressure. He gets closer and closer, but still can't see what's in the middle of the dark area. It's hard to focus, and lifting his head up to look takes so much effort that he gives up trying. He just keeps crawling. Finally, he reaches the area he'd seen from the dune. It takes him a minute of crawling on it before he realizes that he's no longer on sand. He's now crawling on some kind of dark stone. Stone with some kind of marking on it. A pattern cut into the stone. He's too tired to stand up and try to see what the pattern is, so he just keeps crawling. He crawls toward the center, where his blurry eyes still see something in the middle of the dark stone area. His mind, detached in a strange way, note that either his hands and knees are so burnt by the sand they no longer feel pain, or that this dark stone in the middle of the burning desert with a pounding, punishing sun overhead doesn't seem to be hot. It almost feels cool as ice. He considers lying down on the nice, cool surface. Cool, dark stone. Not a good sign. He must be hallucinating this. He's probably in the middle of a patch of sand, already lying face down and dying, just imagining this whole thing. A desert mirage. Soon the beautiful women carrying pitchers of water and a Sega Genesis will come up and start giving him a drink. Then he'll know he's gone. He decides against laying down on the cool stone. If he's going to die here in the middle of this hallucination, he at least wants to see what's in the center before he goes. He keeps crawling. It's the third time that he hears the voice before he realizes what he's hearing. He would hear that someone just said, "Greetings, traveler. You don't look so well. Do you hear me?" He stops crawling. He tries to look up from where he is on his hands and knees, but it's too much effort to lift his head, so he tries something different. He rolls over and leans back, trying to sit up on the stone. After a few seconds, he catches his balance, avoids falling on his face, sits up, and tries to focus his eyes. Blurry. He rubs his eyes with the back of his hands and tries again. Better this time. Yep, he can see. He's sitting in the middle of a large, flat, dark expanse of stone. Sitting directly next to him, about 3 feet away, is a white post or pole about 2 inches in diameter, sticking about 4 or 5 feet out of the stone at an angle. And wrapped around this white rod is what must be a 15-foot-long desert diamondback rattlesnake, with a hovering tail and rattle, seemingly prepared to start rattling, looking directly at him. He stares at the snake in shock. He doesn't have the energy to get up and run away. He doesn't even have the energy to crawl away. This is it. His final resting place. No matter what happens, he's not going to be able to move from this spot. He just wants to die anywhere else. If only he could die anywhere else. Come with him, let's die anywhere else. Anyway, just not here.
Oh no!
Well, at least dying from a bite from this monster should be quicker than dying of thirst. He'll face his end like a man. He struggles to get up a little straighter. The snake keeps watching him. He lifts one hand and flicks it in the snake's direction, feebly. Snake watches the hand for a moment, then goes back to watching the man, looking into his eyes. Maybe the snake has no interest biting in him. Hasn't rattled yet, that's a good sign. Maybe he isn't gonna die of snake bite after all. He's just gonna die a horrible death of dehydration instead.
That's because the owl's not here to tell him it's a poisonous snake.
He then remembers that he'd looked up when he reached the center here because he thought he'd heard a voice. He's still very woozy. He feels like he might pass out soon. The sun still beats down on him, even though he is now on cool, cool stone. He still doesn't have anything to drink. Well, maybe he actually heard a voice. The stone doesn't look natural, nor does that white post sticking out of the stone. Someone must have built this. Maybe they're still nearby. Maybe that's who talked to him. Maybe the snake is even their pet, and that's why it isn't biting. He tries to clear his throat to say hello, but he's too dry. All that comes out is a coughing or wheezing sound. There's no way he's going to be able to talk without something to drink. He feels his pocket, and the bottle with the wiper fluid is still there. He shakily pulls out the bottle, almost losing his balance and falling back in the process. This isn't good. He doesn't have much time by his reckoning before he passes out. Also, he's not sure where his socks went. He gets the bottle open, manages to get the bottle to his lip, and pours some of the fluid into his mouth. He sloshes around and then swallows it. He coughs a little. His throat feels better. Maybe he can talk now. He tries again. Ignoring the snake, he turns to look around him, hoping to spot the owner of this place, and croaks out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" He hears from his side, "Greetings. What is it that you want?" He turns his head back towards the snake. That's where the sound came from. The only thing he can think of is that there must be a speaker hidden under the snake, or maybe built into the post. He decides to try asking for help. "Please," he croaks again, feeling dizzy. I'd love not to be thirsty anymore. I've been without water for a long time. Can you help me?" Looking in the direction of the snake, hoping to see where the voice was coming from this time, he's shocked to see the snake rear back, open its mouth, and speak. He hears it say as the Disney overtakes him and he falls forward face first on the stone. Very well. Coming up. A piercing pain shoots through his shoulder. Suddenly he's awake. He sits up and grabs his shoulder, wincing at the throbbing pain. He is momentarily disoriented as he looks around, and then he remembers to crawl through the sand, the dark area of stone, the snake. He sees the snake, still wrapped around the white tilted post, still looking at him. He reaches up to the shoulder where it hurts. It feels slightly wet. He pulls his fingers away and looks at them. Blood. He feels his shoulder again. It feels like his shirt has 2 holes in it. 2 puncture holes. They match up with the 2 aching spots of pain in his shoulder. He has been bitten by the snake. It'll feel better in a minute. He looks up. It's the snake talking. He hadn't dreamed it. He did dream the Sega Saturn, however. Suddenly he notices he's not dizzy anymore. And more importantly, he's not thirsty anymore, at all. Have I died? Is this the afterlife? Why are you biting me in the afterlife? Sorry about that, but I had to bite you, says the snake. That's the way I work. It all comes through the bite. Think of it as natural medicine. You bit me to help me? Why am I not thirsty anymore? Did you give me a drink before you bit me? How did I drink enough while unconscious to not be thirsty anymore? I haven't had a drink in over 2 days, well, except the windshield wiper fluid. Hold it. How does the snake work? Are you real? Are you some sort of Disney animation? No, says the snake. I'm real. As real as you or anyone is anyway. I didn't give you a drink. I bit you. That's how it works. It's what I do. I bite. Plus, I don't have hands to give you a drink, even if I had water just sitting here. The man sat stunned for a minute. Here he was, sitting in the middle of the desert in some strange stone that should be hot but wasn't, talking to a snake that could talk back and had just bitten him, and he felt better. Not great. He was still starving and exhausted, but much better. He was no longer thirsty. He'd started to sweat again, but only slightly. He felt hot in the sun, but it was starting to get lower in the sky, and the cool stone beneath him was a relief he could notice now that he was no longer dying of thirst. I might suggest that we take care of that methanol you now have in your system with the next request, continued the snake. I can guess why you drank it, but I'm not sure how much you drank or how much methanol was left in the wiper fluid. That stuff is nasty. It'll make you go blind in a day or 2 if you drank enough of it. Next request, said the man. Put his hand back on the hurting shoulder and backed away from the snake a little bit. That's the way you work. It works. If you like, that is, explained the snake. You get 3 requests. Call them wishes if you like. The snake grinned at his own joke, and the man drew back a little further from the show of fangs. But there are rules, the snake continued. First one is free. The second requires an agreement of secrecy. The third requires the binding of responsibility. The snake looks at the man seriously. By the way, the snake says suddenly, my name is Nathan. Old Nathan, Samuel used to call me. He gave me that name. Before that, most of the Bound used to just call me Snake. But that got old, and Samuel wouldn't stand for it. He said that anything that could talk needed a name. He was big into names. You can call me Nate, if you wish. Again, the snake grinned. Sorry if I don't offer to shake, but I think you understand. My shake sounds somewhat threatening. The snake gave his rattle a little shake. My name is Jack, said the man, trying to absorb all this. Jack Sampson. Can I ask you a question? Jack says suddenly. What happened to the poison, in your... Why aren't I dying? How did you do that? What do you mean by that's how you work? That's more than one question, grins Nate. But I'll try to answer all of them. First, yes, you can ask me a question. The snake's grin gets wider. Second, The poison is in you. It changed you. You now no longer need to drink. That's what you asked for, or, well, technically, you asked not to be thirsty anymore. But anymore is such a vague term. I decided to make it permanent. Now, as long as you live, you shouldn't need to drink much at all. Your body will conserve water very efficiently. You should be able to get just enough from the food you eat, much like a desert creature. You've been changed. For the third question, Nate continues, you are still dying. Beside the effect of that methanol in your system, you're a man, and men are mortal. In your current state, I give you no more than just about another 50 years. Assuming you get out of this desert alive, that is. Nathan seems vastly amused at his own humor, and continued his wide grin. As for the fourth question, Nathan said, looking more serious as far as Jack could tell, as Jack was just now getting the hang of reading talking snake emotions from snake facial feet. Sure is. First, you have to agree to make a secondary request and become bound by the secrecy, or I can't tell you. Wait, choked Jack. Is this where you say you can tell me, but then you'd have to kill me? I thought that was implied, Nate continued to look serious. Yeah. Jack leaned back a little as he remembered again that he was talking to a 15-foot poisonous reptile, a poisonous snake,
Oh, there you are,
With-
Cedric.
with a reputation for having a nasty temper. So what's this bound by secrecy stuff, and can you really stop the effects of the methanol? Jack thought for a second. What do you mean methanol, anyway? I thought these days they used ethanol wiper fluid and just to denature it is. They may. I don't really know, said Nate. Haven't gotten out in a while. Maybe they do. All I know is that I smell methanol on your breath and on that bottle in your pocket. And the blue color of the liquid when you pulled it out to drink some, let me guess that it was the wiper fluid. I assume they still color wiper fluid blue. Yeah, they do, said Jack. I figured, replied Nate. As for being bound by secret, with the fulfillment of your next request, you will bound to say nothing about me, this place, or any of the information I will tell you after that, when you decide to go back to your kind. You won't be allowed to talk about me, write about me, use sign language, charades, or even act in a way that will lead someone to guess correctly about me. You will be bound by secrecy. Of course, I'll ask you to promise not to give me away, and as I'm guessing that you're a man of your word, you'll never test the binding anyway, so you won't notice. Nate said the last part with utter confidence. Jack, who had always prided himself on being a man of his word, felt a little nervous at this. Nate, who are you? How did you know that? Are you omniscient or something? Well, Jack, said Nate sadly, I can't tell you that unless you make the second request. Nate looked away for a minute, then looked back. Well, okay, said Jack. What is this about a second request? What can I ask for? Are you allowed to tell me that? Sure, said Nate, brightening. You're allowed to ask for changes. Changes to yourself. They're like wishes, but they can only affect you. Oh, and before you ask, I can't give you immortality, or omniscience, or omnipresence for that matter. Though I might be able to make you gaseous, yet still remain alive, and then you could spread through the atmosphere and sort of be omnipresent. But what good would that be? You still wouldn't be omniscient, and thus you could only focus on one thing at a time. Not very useful, at least in my opinion. Nate stopped when he realized Jack was staring at him. Well, anyway, continued Nate, I'd probably suggest giving you permanent good health. It would negate the methanol now in your system. You'd be immune to most poisons and diseases. And you'd tend to live a very long time, barring accident, of course. And you'll even have a tendency to recover from accidents well. It always seemed like a good choice for a request to me. Cure the methanol poisoning, huh? Said Jack, and keep me healthy for a long time. Sounds good to me, and the request has to be about a change to me. I can't ask to be rich, because that's not really a change to me, right? Right, nodded Nate. Could I ask to be a genius and permanently healthy? Jack asked hopefully. That takes 2 requests, Jack. Yeah, what I figured. But I could ask to be a genius. I could be the smartest scientist in the world or the best athlete. Well, I could make you very smart, admitted Nate. But that wouldn't necessarily make you the best scientist in the world. Or I could make you athletic, but it wouldn't necessarily make you the best athlete ever. You've heard the saying that 99% of genius is hard work? Well, there's some truth to that. I can give you the talent, but I can't make you work hard. It all depends on what you decide to do with it. Said Jack. Okay, I think I understand. Can I get a 3rd request after this one? Maybe, said Nate. Depends on what you decide, then. There are more rules for the 3rd request that I can only tell you about after the 2nd request. You know how it goes. Nate looked like he'd shrug if he had shoulders. Okay, well, since I'd rather not be blind in a day or two, and permanent health doesn't sound bad, then consider that my 2nd request, officially. Do I need to sign in blood or something? No, just hold out your hand, or your heel, or whatever part you want me to bite. I have to bite you again. Like I said, how it works. The poison, you know, Nate said apologetically. Jack winced a little and felt his shoulder where the last bite was. Didn't hurt anymore, just like Nate had said. That made Jack feel better about the biting business, but still, standing still while a 15-foot snake sunk its fangs into you. Jack stood up, ignoring how good it felt to be able to stand again and the hunger starting to gnaw at his stomach. Jack decided to try to decide. He tried to decide where he wanted to get bitten. Despite knowing that it wouldn't hurt for long, Jack knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Hey, Jack, Nate suddenly said, looking past Jack, looking towards the dunes behind him. Is that a 3-headed monkey? Jack spun around and looked. Who else could be out here in the middle of nowhere? A 3-headed monkey? And did they bring food? Wait a minute, that's not a 3-headed monkey. What was Nate? My butt! Jack sat down carefully, favoring his more tender buttock. I would have decided eventually, Nate. I was just thinking about it. You didn't have to bamboozle me. I've been doing this a long time, Jack, said Nate confidently. You humans have a hard time sitting still and letting a snake bite you. Especially one my size. And besides, admit it. It's only been a couple of minutes, and it already doesn't hurt anymore, does it? That's because of the health benefit with this one. I told you that you'd healed more quickly. Yeah, well, still, it's the principle of the thing. And nobody likes being bitten in the butt.
I mean,
Couldn't
some
you?
people probably do.
Ooh, kinky. Couldn't you have gotten my calf or something? More meat in the typical human butt, replied Nate. And less chance you accidentally kick me or move at the last second. Okay, yeah, you're... Tell me all these wonderful secrets that I now qualify to hear. Okay, said Nate. Do you want to ask questions first, or do you want me to just start talking? Just talk. I'll sit here and try not to think about a delicious cheesesteak or poutine or mac and cheese balls.
Lantern, eat before these happen.
We could go try to rustle up some food for you first, if you'd like, answered Nate. You didn't tell me you had food around here, Nate. What do we have? Am I in walking distance to town, or can you magically whip up food along with your other powers? Jack was almost shouting with excitement. His stomach had been growling for hours. I was thinking more like I could flush something out of its hole and bite it for you, and you could skin it and eat it. Assuming you have a knife, that is, replied Nate with a grin that Jack was starting to get used to. Said Jack, sitting back down. I think I'll pass. I can last a little longer before I get desperate enough to eat horned rat, or whatever else it is you find. There's nothing to burn. I'd have to eat it raw. No thanks, just talk. Okay, replied Nate, still grinning. But I'd better hurry before you start looking at me as food. Fun fact, I've eaten alligator, never had rattlesnake, although I do know a couple restaurants around here do sell it. Nate reared back a little, looking around for a second, and then continued. You, Jack, are sitting in the middle of the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, honey. Don't you know that I'll always be true? Jack looked around at the sand and the dunes, and then looked back at Nate skeptically. Well, that's the best I can figure it anyway, Jack, said Nate. Stand up and look at the symbol on the rock here. Nate gestured at the dark stone they were sitting on with his nose. Jack stood up and looked. Carved into the stone was a representation of a large tree. The angled pole that Nate was wrapped around was coming out of the trunk of the tree, right below where the main branches left the trunk to reach out across the stone. It was very well done. Looked more like a tree had been reduced to 2 dimensions and been embedded in the stone than it did like a carving. Jack walked around and looked at the details in the fading light and the setting sun. He wished he'd look at it while the sun was still higher in the sky. Wait, the sun was setting. That meant he was going to have to spend another night out here. Damn it! Jack looked out across the desert for a little bit and then came back and stood next to Nate. In all the excitement, I almost forgot, Nate, said Jack. Which way is it back to town, and how far? I'm eventually going to have to head back, and I'm not sure I'll be able to survive by eating raw desert critters for long. And even if I can, I'm not sure I want to. It's about 30 miles that way, Nate pointed, with the rattle on his tail this time. As far as Jack could tell, it was a direction at right angles to the way he'd been going when he was crawling here. But that's 30 miles by the way the crow flies. It's about 40 by the way a man walks. You should be able to do it in about half a day with your improved endurance if you head out early tomorrow, Jack. Jack looked around out the way the snake had pointed for a few seconds more, and then sat back down. It was getting dark. Not much he could do about heading out right now, right? Besides, Nate was just getting to the interesting stuff. So, Garden of Eden, best as you can figure it? Well, yeah, as best as Samuel and I could figure it anyway, said Nate. He figured that the story just got a little mixed up. You know, snake in a tree, offering temptations, making bargains, that kind of stuff. But he could never quite figure out how the Hebrews found out about this spot from across the ocean. He worried about that for a while. Garden of Eden, huh? Said Jack. How long have you been here, Nate? I have no idea, really, replied Nate. A long time. Never occurred to me to count years until recently, and by then, it was far too late. But I do remember when this whole place was green, so I figured it's been thousands of years at least. So you're the snake that tempted Eve. Beats me, said Nate. Maybe. I can't remember the first one of your kind that I talked to was female or not. I never got a name. But it could have been. And I suppose she could have considered my offer to grant requests of temptation, though I've rarely had refusals. Well, how did you get here then, and why is that white pole stuck out of the stone there? My father left me here. Or I assume it was my father. It was another snake, much bigger than I was back then. I remember talking to him, but I don't remember if it was in a language or just kind of understanding what he wanted. But one day he brought me to this stone, told me about it, and asked me to do something for him. I talked it over with him for a while and agreed. I've been here ever since. What is this place? And what did he ask you to do? Well, you see this pole here sticking out of the stone? Nate loosened his coils around the tilted white pole and showed Jack where it descended into the stone. The pole was tilted at about a 45-degree angle and seemed to enter the stone in an 18-inch slot cut into the stone. Jack leaned over and looked. The slot was dark, and the pole went down into it as far as Jack could see in the dim light. Jack reached out to touch the pole, but Nate was suddenly there in the way. You can't touch that yet, Jack, said Nate. Why not? I haven't explained it to you yet. Well, it kinda looks like a lever or something, said Jack. You'd push it that way and it would move in the slot. That is what it is. What does it do? Asked Jack. End the world? Oh, no, said Nate. Nothing that drastic. It just ends humanity. I call it the lever of doom. For the last few words, Nate had used a deeper, ringing voice. He tried to look serious for a few seconds and then gave up and grinned. Jack was initially startled by Nathan's pronouncement, but when Nathan grinned, Jack laughed. You almost fooled me for a second. What does it really do? Oh, it really ends humanity, like I said. You just thought the voice I used was funny, didn't you? A lever to end humanity, asked Jack. What in the world for? Why would anyone need to end humanity? Well, replied Nathan, I get the idea that humanity was an experiment. Or maybe the big guy just thought that if humanity started going really bad, there should be a way to end it. I'm not really sure. All I know are the rules, and the guesses that Samuel and I had about why it's here. Didn't think to ask back when I started here. Rules? What rules? The rules are that I can't tell anybody about it, or let them touch it unless they agree to be bound to secrecy by a bite. And that only one human can be bound in that way at a time. That's it. Jack looked somewhat shocked. You mean I could pull the lever now? You'd let me end humanity? Yes, replied Nathan, if you really want to. Nate looked at Jack carefully. Do you want to, Jack? No. Why in the world would anyone want to end humanity? It'd take a psychotic to want that. Or worse, a suicidal psychotic, because that would kill him too, wouldn't it? Yes, replied Nate, being as he'd be human too. Has anyone ever seriously considered? Any of those bound to secrecy, that is? Well, of course. I think they've all seriously considered it at one time or another. Being given that kind of responsibility makes you sit down or think, or so I'm told. Samuel considered it several times. He'd often get disgusted with humanity, come out here and just hold the lever for a while. But he never pulled it. Or you wouldn't be here. Nathan grinned some more. Jack sat down, well back away from the lever. He looked thoughtful and puzzled at the same time. After a bit he said, So this makes me the judge of humanity? I get to decide whether they keep going or just end? Me? That seems to be it, agreed Nate. What kind of criteria do I use to decide? How do I make this decision? Am I supposed to decide if they're good, or too many of them are bad, or that they're just going the wrong way? Is there a set of rules for this? No. You pretty much just have to decide on your own. It's up to you. However you want to decide it. I guess that you're just supposed to know. But what if I get mad at someone, or some girl taunts me and I feel horrible? Couldn't I make a mistake? How do I know I won't screw up? Nate gave his kind of snake-like shrug. You don't. You just have to try your best, Jack. Jack sat there for a while, staring off into the desert that was rapidly getting dark, chewing on a fingernail. Suddenly, Jack turned around and looked at the snake. Nate, was Samuel the one bound to this before me? Yes, replied Nate. He was a good man, talked to me a lot. Taught me to read and brought me books. I think I still have a good pile of them buried in the sand around here somewhere. I still miss him. He died a few months ago. Sounds like a good guy. How did he handle this when you first told him? What did he do? Well, said Nathan. He sat down for a while, thought about it for a bit, and then asked me some questions. Much like you're doing now. What did he ask about, if you're allowed to tell me? He asked me about the third request. Aha! And what did you tell him? I told him the rules for the third request. That to get the third request, you have to agree to this whole thing. That if it ever comes to the point you really think that humanity should be ended, you'll come here and end it. You won't avoid it. You won't wimp out. Nate looked serious again. And you'll be bound to do it, too. Jack looked back out into the darkness for a while. Nate was watching, waiting. Nate? What did Samuel ask for with his third request? Nate sounded like he was grinning again as he replied, also quietly. Wisdom, Jack. He asked for wisdom, as much as I could give him. Okay, said Jack suddenly, standing up and facing away from Nate. Give it to me. Nate looked at Jack's butt. It was a nice butt.
Just got a couple of holes in it.
Yeah, but it was still a quality butt, all in all. Give you what, Jack? Give me the Triforce of Wisdom. Give the same stuff Samuel asked for. If it helped him, maybe it'll help me too. Jack turned his head to look back over his shoulder at Nate. It did help him, right? He said it did, replied Nate, but he seemed a little quieter afterward. Like he had a lot to think about. Oh yeah, I can see that. So give it to me. Jack turned to face away from Nate again, bent over slightly and tensed up. Nate watched Jack tense up with a little exasperation. If he bit Jack now, Jack would likely jump out of his skin and maybe hurt them both. You do remember that you'll be bound to destroy humanity if it ever looks like it needs it, right, Jack? Said Nate, shifting position. Yeah, I got that, replied Jack, squeezing his eyes tightly shut and body tense, not noticing the change in direction of Nate's voice. And, continued Nate from his new position, do you remember that you'll turn bright purple and grow big horns next to your eyes? Yeah, wait a minute! Purple? Is that like the purple pushpop? He didn't see Nate there. With the moonlight, Jack could see the lever extend out from the slot in the rock without the snake still wrapped around it. Jack heard from behind him, not like the purple pushpop, right before he felt the now familiar piercing pain in his other butt. Jack sat on the edge of the dark stone in the rapidly cooling air, his feet extending out into the sand. He stared out into the darkness, listening to the wind stir the sand, occasionally rubbing his butt where he'd been bitten. Nate had left for a little while, had come back with a desert rodent-shaped bulge somewhere in his middle, and was now wrapped back around the lever, his tongue flicking out into the desert. The only sign he was still awake. Occasionally, Jack, with his toes absent-mindedly digging in the sand, while he thought, would ask Nate a question without turning around. Nate, do accidents count? What do you mean, Jack? Jack tilted his head back as if he was looking at the stars. You know, accidents. If I accidentally fall on the liver without meaning to, does that still wipe out humanity? I'm pretty sure it does, Jack. I suggest you be careful about that now if you start feeling wobbly. Does it have to be me that pulls the lever? That's the rule, Jack. No one else can pull it. No. I mean, does it have to be my hand? Can I pull the lever with a rope tied around it, or push it with a stick, or throw it with a rock? Yes, those should work, replied Nathan, though I'm not sure how complicated you could get. Samuel thought about trying to build some kind of remote control for it once, but gave it up. Everything he built would be gone by the next sunrise if it was touching the stone or over it. I told him in the past that others that had been bound tried to bury the lever so they wouldn't be tempted to pull it. But every time the stones or sand or whatever had disappeared. Wow. Cool. Nate, how long did Samuel live? One of his wishes was for health too, right? Asked Jack. Yes, replied Nate. It was. He'd lived 167 years, Jack. Wow, 167 years. That's almost 140 more years I'll live if I live as long. Do you know what he died of?
Dysentery.
Nate sighed deeply. He died of getting tired of living, Jack. Sounding somewhat sad. Jack turned his head to look at Nate in the starlight. Nate looked back. Samuel knew he wasn't going to be able to stay in society. He figured that they'd eventually see him alive and start questioning it, so he decided that he'd have to disappear for a while. He faked his death once, but changed his mind. He decided it was too early and he could stay for a little longer. He wasn't very fond of mankind, but he liked the attention. Most of the time, anyway. His daughter and then his wife dying almost did him in, though. He didn't stay in society much longer after that. He eventually came out here to spend time talking to me and thinking about pulling the lever. A few months ago, he told me that he'd had enough. It was his time. And then he just died? Asked Jack. Nate shook his head a little, sadly. He made his fourth request, Jack. There's only one thing you can ask for the fourth request. The last bite. Nathan was quiet for a little bit, and then continued. He told me that he was tired, that it was his time. He assured me that someone new would show up soon, like they always did. After another pause, Nathan finished. Samuel's body disappeared off the stone, with the sunrise. Jack lay back down and looked at the sky, leaving Nate alone with his memories. It was a long time until Jack's breathing evened out into sleep. Jack woke with the sunrise the next morning. He was a little chilled with the morning desert air, but overall was feeling pretty darn good. Well, except his stomach was grumbling and he wasn't willing to eat raw desert rat. So after getting directions to town from Nate, making sure he knew how to get back, and reassuring Nate that he'd be back soon, Jack started the long walk back to town. With his new health and Nate's good directions, he made it back easily. Jack caught a bus back to the city and showed up for work the next day, a little worse for wear, and with a story about getting lost in the desert and walking back out. Within a couple of days, Jack had talked a friend with a tow truck into going back out into the desert with him to fetch the SUV. They found it after a couple of hours of searching and towed it back without incident. Jack was careful to not even look in the direction of Nate's lever, though their path back didn't come in sight of it. Before the next weekend, Jack had gone to a couple of stores, including the bookstore, and gotten his SUV back from the mechanic, with a warning to avoid any more joyriding in the desert. On Saturday, Jack headed back to see Nate. Jack parked a little way out of the small town near Nate, loaded up his new backpack with camping gear and the things he was bringing for Nate, and started walking. He figured that walking would leave the least trail, and he knew that while not many people camped in the desert, it wasn't unheard of and shouldn't be really suspicious. Jack brought more books for Nathan. Recent books, magazines, newspapers, some things that would catch Nate up with what was happening in the world, others that were just good things to read.
Snake
He-
Monthly.
Snake Monthly. He brought him Undertale, the musical. He spent the weekend with Nate, and then headed out again, telling Nate that he'd be back again soon, but that he had things to do first. Over 4 months later, Jack was back to see Nate again. This time he brought a laptop with him, a specially modified laptop. It had a solar recharger, special filters and seals to keep out the sand, a satellite link-up, and a special keyboard and joystick that Jack hoped that a 15-foot rattlesnake would be able to use. And it had been hacked to not give out its location by satellite. It had Steam, it had Night in the Woods, it had Undertale, it had numerous Final Fantasies, it had Dragon Quest XI.
It actually had the snake game on it.
It had the snake game, it had Bear Simulator, it had Goat Simulator. After that, Jack could email Nate to keep in touch, they could play Castle Crashers together, but he still visited him regularly, at least once or twice a year. After the first year, Jack quit his job. For some reason, with the wisdom he'd been given, and the knowledge that he could live for over 150 years, working the old 9 to 5 didn't seem worthwhile anymore. He went back to school. Eventually, Jack started writing. Perhaps because of the wisdom, or perhaps because of his new perspective, he wrote well. People liked what he wrote, and he became well known for it. After a time, Jack bought an RV and started traveling around the country for book signings and readings. But he still remembered to drop by and visit Nate occasionally. On one of the visits, Nate seemed quieter than usual. Not that Nate had been a fountain of joy lately. Jack's best guess was that Nate was still missing Samuel, and though Jack had tried, he still hadn't been able to replace Samuel in Nate's eyes. Nathan had been getting quieter each visit, but on this visit, Nate didn't even speak when Jack walked up to the lever. He nodded at Jack and then went back to staring into the desert. Jack, respecting Nate's silence, sat down and waited. After a few minutes, Nate spoke. Jack, I have someone to introduce you to. Jack looked surprised. Someone to introduce me to? This something to do with the big guy? No. This is more personal. I want you to meet my son. Nate looked over at the nearest sand dune. Sammy! Jack watched as a 4-foot-long desert rattlesnake crawled from behind the dune and up to the stone base of the limb. Yo, Jack, said the new, much smaller snake. Yo, Sammy. Jack looked at Nate. Named after Samuel, I assume. Nate nodded. Jack, I have got a favor to ask you. Can you show Sammy around for me? Nate unwrapped himself from the lever and slithered over to the edge of the stone and looked around the sands. When Samuel first told me about the world and brought me books and pictures, I wished that I could go see it. I wanted to see the great forests, the canyons, the cities, even the other deserts, see if they felt and smelled the same. I want my son to have that chance, to see the world, before he becomes bound here, like I have been. He's seen it in the pictures over the computer that you brought me, but I hear that it's not the same, that being there is different. I want him to have that. Can you do this for me, Jack? Jack nodded. This was obviously very important to Nate, so Jack didn't even joke about taking a talking rattlesnake out to see the world. Of course I can do that for you, Nate. Is that all you need? Nate looked at Sammy. Sammy looked back at Nate for a second and then said, Oh, I've got to pack. Be back in a little bit, Jack. Nice to meet you. Sammy slithered back over the dune and out of sight. Nate watched Sammy disappear and then looked back at Jack. Jack, this is my first son. My first offspring through all the years. You don't even want to know what it took me to find a mate. But anyway, I had a son for a reason. I'm tired. I'm ready for it to be over. I needed a replacement. Jack considered this for a minute. So you're ready to come see the world and you wanted him to watch the lever while you were gone? Nate shook his head. No, Jack, you're a better guesser than that. You already figured out. I'm bound here. There's only one way for me to leave here. And I'm ready. It's my time. Jack looked more closely at Nate. He could tell Nate had thought about this, probably for quite a while. Jack had trouble imagining what it would be like to be as old as Nate, but Jack could already tell that in another 100 or 200 years, he might be getting tired of life himself. Jack could understand Samuel's decision and now Nate's, so all Jack said was, What do you want me to do? Nate nodded. Thanks, Jack. I only wanted two things. One, show Sammy around the world. Let him get his fill of it until he's ready to come back here and take over. Two, give me the fourth request. I can't just decide to die, not any more than you can. I won't even die of old age like you eventually will, even though it'll be a long time from now. I need to be killed. Once Sammy is back here, ready to take over, I'll be able to die, and I need you to kill me. I even thought about how poisons and other drugs won't work on me. I've seen pictures of snakes that were shot. Some of them live for days. So that's out too. So I want you to bring back a sword. Nate turned away to look back to the dune Sammy had gone behind. I'd say an axe, but that's somewhat undignified. Putting my head on the ground or a chopping block like that. No, I'd like a sword, a time-honored way of going out, a dignified way to die. And most importantly, that should work. Even on me. Are you willing to do that for me, Jack? Yeah, Nate, I think I can handle that. Good. He turned back to the dune and shouted, Sammy! Jack's about ready to leave. Then quietly, Thanks, Jack. Jack didn't have anything to say to that, so he waited for Sammy to make it back to the lever, nodded to him, nodded a final time to Nate, and then headed into the desert with Sammy following. Over the next several years, Sammy and Jack kept in touch with Nate through email as they went about their adventures. They made a goal of visiting every country in the world and did a respectable job of it. Sammy had a natural gift for languages, as Jack expected he would, and even ended up acting as a translator for Jack in a few of the countries. Jack managed to keep the talking rattlesnake hidden, even so, and by the time they were nearing the end of their tour of countries, Sammy had only been spotted a few times. While there were several people that had seen enough to startle them greatly, nobody had enough evidence to prove anything. And while a few wild rumors and stories had followed Jack and Sammy around, nothing ever hit the newspapers or the public in general. When they finished their tour of the countries, Jack suggested they try some undersea diving. They did. And spelunking, they did that too. Sammy finally drew the line at visiting Antarctica. He'd come to realize that Jack was stalling. After talking to his dad about it over email, he figured out that Jack probably didn't want to have to kill Nate. Nate told Sammy that humans could be squeamish about killing friends and acquaintances. So Sammy eventually put his tail down, the whole lack of feet thing.
He could have gotten in a boot. And then
He could have!
in his boot.
There was a snake in Jack's boot, and he put his foot down and told Jack that it was time. He was ready to go back and take up the duties from his dad. Jack delayed it a little more by insisting that they go back to Japan and buy an appropriate sword. He even stretched it a little more by getting lessons in how to use the sword. But eventually, he learned as much as he likely was going to without dedicating his life to it, and was definitely competent enough to take the head off a snake. It was time to go back and see Nate. When they got back to the US, Jack got the old RV out of storage where he and Sammy had left it after their tour of the 50 states. Loaded Sammy up in the sword, and they headed for the desert. When they got to the small town that Jack had been trying to find those years ago when he met Nate, Jack was in a funk. He didn't really feel like walking all the way out there. Not only that, but he'd forgotten to figure out the travel time correctly, and it was late afternoon. They'd either have to spend the night in town and walk out tomorrow, or walk in the dark. As Jack was afraid that if he waited one more night he might lose his resolve, he decided that he'd go ahead and drive the RV out there. It was only going to be this once, and Jack would go back and cover the tracks afterwards. They ought to be able to make it out there by nightfall, if they drove, and they could get it over tonight. Jack told Sammy to email Nate that they were coming as soon as he drove out of sight. They'd be coming round the desert when they come. They'd be coming round the desert when they come. They then pulled off the road and headed out into the desert. Everything went well, until they got to the sand dunes. Jack had been nursing the RV along the whole time, over the rocks, through the creek beds, revving the engines the few times they almost got stuck. When they came to the dunes, Jack didn't really think about it, just downshifted and headed for the first one. By the third dune, Jack started to regret that he decided to try driving around on the sand. That's why dune buggies with special suspension are a thing, after all.
Mm-hmm.
The RV was fishtailing, losing traction. Jack was having to work it up each dune slowly and was trying to keep from losing control each time they came over the top and slid down the other side. Sammy had to come to sit up in the passenger seat, coiled up and laughing at Jack's driving. As they came up over the top of the fourth dune, the biggest one yet, Jack saw that this was the final dune, the stone, the lever, and somewhere Nate waited below. Jack put on the brakes, but he'd gone a little too far. The RV started slipping down the other side.
Uh-oh.
Jack tried turning the wheel, but he didn't have enough traction. He pumped the brakes. No response. They started sliding down the hill, faster and faster. Jack felt a shock go through him as he suddenly realized that they were heading for the lever. He looked down. The RV was directly on course for it. If Jack didn't do something, the RV would hit it. He was about to end humanity. Jack steered more frantically, trying to get traction. It wasn't working. The dune was too steep, and the sand too loose. In a split second, Jack realized that his only chance would be once he hit the stone around the lever. He should have traction on the stone for just a second before he hit the lever. He wouldn't have time to stop, but he should be able to steer away. Jack took a better grip on the steering wheel and tried to turn the RV a little bit. Every little bit would help. He'd have to time it just right. The RV got to the bottom of the dune, sliding at an amazing speed in the sand. Just before they reached the stone, Jack looked across it to check that they were still heading for the lever. They were. But Jack noticed something else that he hadn't seen from the top of the dune. Nate wasn't wrapped around the lever. He was off to the side of the lever, but still on the stone, waiting for them. The problem was, he was waiting on the same side of the lever that Jack had picked to steer towards to avoid the lever. The RV was already starting to drift that way a little in its mad rush across the sand, and there was no way that Jack was going to be able to go around the lever to the other side. Jack had an instant of realization. He was either going to have to hit the lever or run over Nate. He glanced over at Sammy and saw that Sammy had realized the same thing. Jack took a firmer grip on the steering wheel as the RV ran up on the stone. Drawing on all the wisdom that he had been gifted, he shouted to Sammy, "Better Nate than lever!"
Over a fucking hour. For that.
Thank you, everyone.
And now I can end the video. Thank you for sticking around, folks.